Good morning, everyone. My name is Eran Kinsbruner, and I'm truly excited to kick this webinar off this morning. Today's webinar is all about continuous testing for DevOps, continuous testing, the path forward. And with me, I have Wayne Ariola from Tricentis. Good morning, Wayne.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And this is an exciting topic, looking at the number of registrants and attendees online. So really appreciate everyone joining us today. We have prepared very exciting content for you. Before I introduce myself, just a few housekeeping information because people are asking online. So this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing with all of you online both the recording and the slides. You are welcome to use the chat panel as some of you already started. We will be addressing all the questions during and after the webinar. And with that, I would like to start. As mentioned, my name is Eran Kinsbruner. I am the lead software evangelist at Perfecto, blogger, speaker, author of 2 books. One of them is the Digital Quality Handbook. The second is Continuous Testing for DevOps Professionals. The second one was in collaboration with Tricentis, which are leading in the continuous testing space. You can find me through this social Twitter handles, LinkedIn, or email me if you like. And I would like to also introduce and welcome Wayne. Hi, Wayne, again.
Hi, thank you very much again for having me. And I've been in the software testing space for too long, 20 years, which seems like an eternity. Yet, the funny thing is, as we look at the initiatives associated with continuous testing, the one thing about our industry, which sincerely amazes me, is software testing has been able to continuously evolve and reinvent itself. And I think we're at probably one of the most exciting times ever when it comes from software test or software test automation. So I'm happy to be here. If you'd like to communicate with me, there's my Twitter handle. I get so much email, so quite honestly, don't email me, but LinkedIn and Twitter is a fantastic way to chat if you'd like to.
Thanks, Wayne. So let's see what we have prepared for you guys online and move to the agenda. From an agenda slide, from an agenda perspective, we're going to start. Wayne is going to lead the entire conversation, talking about the digital transformation. What are the implications of this digital transformation? Give some introduction to what is continuous testing. Many of us are seeing continuous testing used in different ways, agile testing. So we're going to give a very clear definition to what it is, and also what it means to be a mature continuous testing organization, good versus bad practices. We'll give you some recommendations which can be applied to mature your existing testing practices. And at the end, we're going to run a very short demo showing the integration that it is today in the mobile space between Tricentis Tosca and the Perfecto Lab in the cloud, and also leave time for Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Wayne.
Fantastic. Let's go for it. So, first of all, I think the idea here is that, are we in the era in which we're in the same old testing paradigm? I know day to day it might seem that way, but today this idea of digital transformation has become a boardroom topic. And whenever I hear the word digital transformation, I always kind of think to myself, haven't we been digitally transforming for 20 years? What's the difference? Why does it mean something? And I know we've heard some of it before, but your boards are now talking about how does our organization thrive with the threat of Amazon? How does our organization thrive with the threat of Google? And there's not one industry out there that is safe from this particular paradigm. And the idea that your competition is out there leveraging digital as the method to actually connect your user community and make a delightful experience or a better experience for your end users is the new frontier, right? Software is the interface to the business, and when the software fails, quite honestly, the company fails. And that is more a reality today than any other time in history. Eran, just one thing that I've been doing over the last 7 years here is I've been tracking when software failures hit the news. And what I do is for public organizations, I look at their stock price when that news article hits the wire. So for example, not to point fingers here, so when a major airline had a software outage associated with their baggage claim in a large metropolitan European city, you could track, quite honestly, the impact of the stock price when the software failure hit the news. And quite honestly, what has happened is there's a pretty interesting trend, is that organizations that have software failures that hit the news lose roughly 6% of their total valuation during the time of that announcement. So this equates to this particular airlines to almost $10 billion of valuation loss when that particular news item hit the wire. So the reason why I mention this is that this idea of having a flawless customer experience is imperative. And why did this news go viral? Well, it's quite honestly, everyone is so connected. Social media takes over, and all of a sudden the news of a software outage becomes a very viral event. And this is why it has become a boardroom topic. Not only does software drive the differentiation associated with the organization, but it also presents a tremendous risk. And this is where we come up with this idea that if an organization or when your organization takes this idea of digital transformation seriously, it requires continuous testing. And it is not testing as we have experienced it so far today. Today, I know there's this dichotomy that's being defined in terms of shift left or shift right or evolving automation. Today, it requires a reinvention of software testing, which we'll call continuous testing. Eran, maybe you want to chip in here from this
Sure.
perspective and the connection between digital transformation and continuous testing.
Definitely. And I think that this is a very timely conversation as we enter the holiday season. And we used to see, the Black Fridays and all these outages in retail stores, but tying it back also to the technology. So as we see in the latest mobile innovation with the AR kit for iOS and the AR core for Android, most of the retailers today are embracing these technologies to enhance user experiences, so people can get the feeling of what they are buying even before they enter the store or even within the stores. And if they're not getting the right user experience and the performance that they're expecting, obviously it goes back, even not if it's not a huge outage, as you just mentioned, if it's just truncation in text or poor performance or lack of support for the new operating system, this causes a disappointment and business loss. So it's definitely timely, and the innovation continues as we speak.
Agreed. Totally agree. So, digital transformation does require us to take a little bit of a different approach. And this idea that we have to reinvent the software testing lifecycle is, I would say, a transformation effort. So just to be brutally honest, after being in this industry for as long as I have, we are the absolute worst at consuming technology. We are technical by nature. We are confident about our skill sets. Yet we're also pretty blind to the idea of broader transformation. And what I mean by this is that we really need to look inward and understand the end-to-end transformation required to actually transform the organization to keep pace with both the volume as well as the velocity of software changes that will be coming through our pipelines. And this is where I come back to the point that there is no other time in history where software testing has faced this challenge, both in the volume of software changes coming through and the velocity in which we wish to release them. So when it comes to digital transformation, it's going to require us to really take an inward look and a true process transformation effort to keep it parallel with the corporate objectives associated with digital transformation. And I can't emphasize this more, that this is a transformation and not just the ad hoc adoption of another tool set or a different tool set. And I can't be more pointed about that as we move forward in this digital transformation or this DevOps transformation initiative. Eran, did you want to add anything there?
No, I liked in the previous slide the word trust, and I'm definitely going to touch on that as we move forward when talking about digital transformation, continuous testing, and test automation. I think all of these four words are very important and critical when you adopt and move towards continuous testing, which will soon define what it is. But I think that the trust is a key word here, and I definitely attach myself to that in a daily business.
Yeah, you know what? Let's unpack that just a bit, because trust, I think when people see the word trust, they think security, and they certainly should. But trust means more than that. That means you're trusting your consumer and the experience associated with the interaction with the business. It means that I trust the site not only in terms of committing myself as a user, but I also trust the site in terms of the total digital signature and the total digital interaction that I'm going to experience. Let me show you. Let me just give a brief example how, quite honestly, that trust can be eroded too. I was recently shopping online in the world's largest shopping marketplace, and by the way, I purchased something and thought it was a normal transaction, but as it turns out, I had to return it. And I didn't realize it, but 30% of my purchase price was actually billed to my card because I had to return something because it was a restocking fee, and I wasn't aware of that. My digital trust went out the window in this for this particular marketplace, and now, as a consumer, having to read between the lines to ensure my experience is kind of a pain, right? So that is trust to me as well. So this idea of the total consumer experience or total end user experience becomes extraordinarily important. So let's go to the topic of continuous testing. So by the way, this is also the Wikipedia definition, but continuous testing is the process of automating automated tests as part of a software delivery pipeline in order to obtain feedback on business risks, I'm going to emphasize business risks, associated with a software release as rapidly as possible. Okay? I love this definition, not only because it's the Wikipedia definition, but also because I wrote it for Wikipedia. But it introduces some interesting concepts. It introduces business risk as a core contextual metric for assessing the quality of software. And today, when I look at testing across the board, I'm going to get into this as we introduce the continuous testing metrics. Business risk is a radically misunderstood concept from us as testers. There's a large gap between what is considered a business risk from your C-level folks to what is considered a business risk from your testers. And that gap, call it the geek gap if you wish, needs to close in order for us to achieve truly continuous testing. But let's also put the stake in the sand again with continuous testing. Continuous testing is about giving the right feedback at the right time to the right stakeholder. And I'm going to add something here, which is actionable. So today we produce a ton of feedback when it comes to our testing process. Yet what is actionable is only a fraction of what is being reported, right? Or what is being reported, you can only take action on a fraction of that. And we got to close that gap as well. And the second point here is there's a number of different people out there now jumping on continuous testing as a term, and they're shoving continuous testing in a corner, whether it's right or left or shift left, or whether it's traditional testing. It does not matter. Continuous testing can be towards the left or developer or SDET oriented. It can be towards the right in which you monitor production. It can be the expansion of more traditional testing. Whatever it is, it's the right feedback at the right time for the right stakeholder, which is actionable. Okay? That's the definition of continuous testing.
Wayne, I think that's the perfect slide to start the conversation. I don't want to repeat everything you said because I think it's perfect. I just want to tackle it from a different angle and
Please.
say that because when you want continuous testing to meet these objectives, to provide the right feedback at the right time to the right stakeholders, and when you're talking about a DevOps team, the stakeholders can vary. I think that maintenance should also be a keyword, because if you're not continuously maintaining all the test artifacts, the results, the test code itself, then you are going to start losing points in your overall cycle. So maintaining whatever you have in the slide at any given time per each software iteration is a key towards moving forward and continuously improving.
Great, fantastic point. And obviously, one of the biggest challenge points associated with sustained automation. Yeah, totally agree with you. So let's take a little snapshot on where we are as an industry. So from a system architecture perspective, we are moving into the era of mass decentralization. Concepts like microservices, cloud-native applications, SaaS-based applications, and APIs are giving us the ability to really look at really highly decentralized processes or transactions, which are being enabled by basically asynchronous calls, which allows us to have this system architecture of the future to be highly, highly decentralized. Obviously, if you're a Global 2000 organization, you have a litany of back-end systems that are assisting you in maintaining your operational cadence. Large back-end systems like SAP or homegrown native transaction-based systems. Those are going to be hard to go away, but I don't think there is an organization out there that does not have a modernization concept in place, which gets you to a much more decentralized architecture. And then let's look at development team structures. So development team structures, as architectures began to decentralize, also began to decentralize. And we saw this with Agile. We saw this with formation of different types of teams. And we certainly see this as value stream concepts come into play. But we're also seeing that dev teams, in terms of decentralization from a productivity perspective, is starting to plateau, meaning that the decentralization of the actual team into smaller groups now creates a little bit of a constraint, as these decentralized teams now need to communicate with each other in a more decentralized manner, meaning that the idea of a smaller, more cohesive team now needs to collaborate across a broader set of features and functions, or a broader set of transactions. We're starting to see this decentralization start to plateau, hence the shift of this value stream and value stream management concepts. And this is, by the way, I understand that this next line is going to be a little contentious, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. This is a generalization. It doesn't represent everybody and anybody, but the test team structure. What we have seen is that the test team structure has certainly trailed behind the dev team structure in terms of getting to a more decentralized grouping or decentralized team structure. Obviously, there's been a huge motion about embedding software test professionals into the actual work stream and part of the dev team itself, or paired with the dev team itself. But as you see in general, the evolution of the test team has gone from a group who has been a decentralized part of the whole software delivery lifecycle or software development lifecycle to a COE concept, to a digital COE concept, to now moving towards more of an embedded model. And the big theme here is that the test team structure has still trailed the dev team structure, and I think that's somewhat obvious. What's the point of this slide? the point of this slide really brings me to my original point around continuous testing and what is required. It is time to really reassess not only the team structure itself, but the way we are delivering or we can deliver continuous testing within the organization. And let me pause right there and hand it over to Eran for commentary here.
So I think, and we see it today, and again, I just want to complement what you just said. I think that a keyword here in this slide would be skill set. And what we are seeing, other than the decentralizing of test and dev teams, is also the transition and maybe the challenge that both dev and testers have today in feature team squads as it comes to skill set, maturing their skill set, trying to fit into the new world, if you like, and also supporting, the continuous testing efforts. So skill set is definitely something that, whoever is online here needs to keep in mind, again, on top of what Wayne just described.
Perfect. But we have some more to talk about. So I'm gonna pick up the pace just a little bit. So with this idea of the team in transition, the one thing we also got to look out for is when you look at the total cost of quality associated with the IT application budget, the cost of achieving software quality is rising. We're going to see a bump in these numbers, I predict, as we look at 2019 and 2020. But I think we're going to see a bump in the opposite direction, downward, as the quality initiative becomes more distributed, meaning that it isn't the fact that the cost of quality is going to decline, but the set of practices associated with achieving quality will become more evenly distributed throughout the software or the service delivery lifecycle, and it's going to require a way to recalibrate how we're truly, or how much an organization is truly spending as part of the IT application budget. So we have to remember, and I think this is when I have the ability to speak with CIOs. We have I ask them the question all the time. How much do you think you're really spending on software testing or software quality? And whenever I say quality, they immediately move to the testing or the testing line item, and I try to move them. I said, no. How much do you really think you're spending on quality? And the number really is significantly more than this. They think it's more on the array of about 45 to 50% of the total cost associated with overarching quality. Which leaves us to a slide where this came from the State of DevOps report, which I thought was actually pretty compelling, which is the J curve associated with transformation. So we've really boxed our conversation into a few things. One, this idea of continuous testing, and two, the idea that continuous testing requires transformation, right? And with this transformation, I think it's interesting to note the general behavior that is out there associated with adopting automation, meaning that we definitely understand that our first phase of automation delivers some quick wins. Yet, as we're trying to move towards automation, this moves our traditional low performers into a little bit more of a progressed state, meaning that you see a nice hit or a nice positive impact associated with automation as your metrics become more standardized and more stable over time. Yet, the first thing that happens is that the requirement to keep pace, and this leads to Eran's mention of maintenance, right? This idea of keeping the automation current with the code base becomes a mounting level of effort, which an organization needs to make an extraordinarily critical decision at this point in time, at this low point in the J curve, which is, what do I do? Do I continue to invest in the automation effort, or do I fall back to manual processes, right? Which obviously over time is going to increase our technical debt. So the idea of this J curve is really predicated on something that we need to understand, which is volume and velocity, meaning that as we progress through digital transformation and DevOps initiatives, the one thing we have to understand in a more distributed architecture is the volume of changes are going to increase, and the velocity or the speed in which those changes need to be deployed is also going to increase. Given that, without automation, your manual efforts you're basically going to fall under the weight of manual efforts, and it will crush you. So this idea of this fourth dot, this second orange dot here, is that the technical debt is increased, and it's more complex, right? And this idea of falling back on manual processes is going to slow your release cycle down. Yet the last green dot on this slide really shows the next phase between these two last dots, which is an organization makes the organizational commitment to automation. And once that is done, you'll see that there is a relentless commitment to maintain and improve the automation. And with this is the demarcation of what is considered a leader versus a laggard in the evolution of continuous testing. And it's an important thing to think about here, because what it means is there's certainly challenges along the way. And as soon as you fall back to the old manual processes, which seems easy, you will be basically compounding the technical debt that will be more and more difficult to unbury yourself. So, with this in mind, I wanted to actually take a little shift here. Over the last 9 months, I worked personally with Forrester to create a research document called the Definitive Software Quality Metrics for Agile and DevOps. And what we really wanted to understand is, what are the practices and the metrics that differentiate a software or a continuous testing leader from a continuous testing laggard? And when you put in the initiatives associated with Agile and DevOps, what are those components that make things change, right? By the way, if you would like to grab this report, it's available online. You can just go to this URL that's up there. We'll send it out, I hope, after the presentation as well, if you'd like to get this report. There's a lot of great facts in it. I'm only going to go through a few of them. But what we're going to go through here are the 5 core continuous testing practices that separate successful DevOps leaders from laggards, the idea of business risks. The idea here, which we just talked about, is to ruthlessly drive end-to-end automation. And then finally, I don't know if we're going to have time for this, but we'll give you the top 20 definitive quality metrics as measured by the leaders in this space. So really quick, here is the summary. And some of this stuff is kind of a no-brainer, right? The DevOps leaders follow the five core continuous testing practices, whereas the laggards certainly rely or fall back on manual testing. I think that's obvious. But in as much as this is obvious, we still, by survey, have less than 30% test automation across the board if you look at Global 2000 organizations, meaning that if you survey Global 2000 organizations and ask them about what level of test automation you're actually achieving, 70% of them are still doing manual testing, right? So that's a big sign out there. Secondly here, leaders are twice as likely to consider automating software quality process as critical business differentiator. They're committed to automation, okay? Whereas the laggards are twice as likely to report testing as a bottleneck to their process. This is probably one of the more interesting ones, this third point, which is leaders focus on contextual metrics, whereas the laggards focus on counting metrics. So number of tests executed, number of tests failed. Basically metrics, which, quite honestly are more important. But when we surveyed these folks and we asked for what priority of metrics helped them drive their software testing process, laggards were more likely to say these counting metrics were their top metrics, versus leaders who said things like requirements coverage or business risk coverage, metrics that gave them more contextual evidence to the quality of a release candidate. And then finally here, the leaders were more likely to measure the user experience across an end-to-end transaction, whereas the laggards were more or less measuring application-specific or team-specific metrics. And I think that's also a huge indicator of following the end-to-end or the user transaction as the basis for the definition of quality. Let me hand it over to you, Eran.
So I think that an important piece, when I'm talking with DevOps leaders or organizations that already adopted continuous testing, I hear a lot of challenges around maintaining all the data, because when you are doing continuous testing, you are executing and you are generating fast feedback to your developers and test engineers few times a day. It can be per hour, per each code commit, etc. And when you want to be on the left hand, you also need to be able to manage all the tons of data that you are generating by the different testing activities. So it's not a sixth element here, but it goes from throughout the entire points that are displayed on the DevOps leaders column, meaning you need to be able to always manage, control, and get decisions out of all the artifacts and testing activities that you conduct, whether you are a developer or test engineer. So that's a very good, I think, insight to add to that slide.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm trying to advance here. So let's go into what were the 5 core continuous testing practices that were basically discovered. First of all, they implement continuous testing to meet the demands of speed or release frequency, meaning that they have a distinct driver associated with the need for continuous testing. Continuous testing is basically met by speed as the number one driver for continuous testing. Secondly, they automate end-to-end functional testing, and let me just unpack this just a little bit. The end-to-end here is the end-to-end transaction across the architecture, not just end-to-end within a system itself. So basically from the mobile interface through the server to the API to the back-end system and returns, right? So understanding the total end-to-end transaction and testing that transaction. Certainly they're shifting testing earlier in the development lifecycle. They have included testers. This was pretty black and white between the leaders and the laggards. They included testers as part of their integrated delivery teams in all parts of the process, right? From end to end, whether it was left or right, testers were part of the entire process itself. And then finally, this is a nuance where I think we've missed as a testing industry for a long, long time, is that they allocate proper testing budgets and focus on upgrading the testing skills. Meaning that, when we faced, a turn towards Agile, there was a tremendous focus on upskilling the development teams for Agile, retraining for Agile, Agile coaches, Agile this, Agile that, but it was all really focused on developers. This same level of investment, it was distinctly available to the test team. So these were the 5 core differentiators associated with organizations that were considered leaders versus organizations who were considered behind the curve or failed in either scaled Agile or DevOps adoption. So another thing that we saw that was a very distinct pattern here is not only do DevOps leaders use more automation, but they also use more advanced practices around that automation. And you can see here that test data management was a significant telltale sign in terms of maturity and leadership, meaning that leaders were much, much more likely to have addressed the idea of test data management or automating test data management in context of their end-to-end testing challenges. Also, concepts like test in production and TDD were significantly more or better adopted associated with the leaders. So it's not only that the leaders had spent the time to automate more, but the breadth of practices that were being used to actually automate were also significant in terms of the findings. Eran, did you want to spend a little time here?
Yeah, just one comment. I think that it all makes sense, and if you want to have a mature continuous testing, software lifecycle within your organization, obviously you want first to have a methodology that supports that, and ATDD, TDD, BDD are definitely the leading methodologies in the industry today that supports continuous testing practices. They definitely facilitate collaboration between developers, testers, and the operational teams as well. So that's one comment. The second, while it's still low on the percentage, but it's going, I think exploratory testing, people will tend to look at exploratory testing as something that is maybe less important. I'm starting to see more and more adoption of this kind of methodology in Agile teams and DevOps teams, because it doesn't take the manual approach of exploratory testing, but rather takes the user experience and actually the experience and skill set of both the developers and testers to provide fast feedback. And if we go back to the first slide, which defines what is continuous testing, one of the key things is to provide fast feedback. Exploratory testing is all about getting fast feedback on what counts.
Absolutely. Let me give an encouraging note here, because I think this is posted as a leader versus laggard slide. But if you look at also API testing, I think our industry has come a long way to realize that the APIs are a critical component of your overall test automation as well as test strategy. And this survey showed that API. If you looked at API testing 3 years ago, you would have seen a massive differentiator between a leader and a laggard in this particular survey. But that has closed out quite nicely over the years. So let's move on. The other thing is DevOps leaders have higher levels of test automation across the board, meaning if you look at how much of each type of test is automated, the leaders really are following significantly more best practices associated with the automation itself. So if you look at acceptance testing, integration testing, and API testing in particular, you'll see that it really just in terms of the automation itself and putting it into a CI process, and having that data be constantly fed back to the teams in terms of automation, it's significant here. I also want to point out test data management and provisioning as well as one of the bigger gaps. Another leading indicator that showed us that test data management is a critical component of overall sustainability and stability of your test suite itself. Eran, going back to your point about the maintenance of automation, I can't emphasize enough, I should say, the importance of making sure that test data management is part of that overarching strategy.
Yeah, totally. And if we'll, when we progress a bit in this webinar, I actually have one slide that talks about continuous maintenance as well, and how you sustain your test automation as your project evolves and as you mature your continuous testing. So I will soon be able to touch it even with more depth.
Yeah, wonderful. And then as you get back to as you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that exploratory testing, risk-based testing, or multivariate analysis. Also, there's a big swing here. There's a huge delta in terms of what the leaders are doing versus what the others are doing. And I do believe those practices make really distinct differences in the outcome of the testing efforts. So really making risk-based testing as a centerpiece of your prioritization is critical for you achieving the speeds that are going to be required for the volume of software changes coming down the pipe. So I want to cover two more points in this survey, and then obviously it's there for you guys to download. There's just a wealth of information here, and how I would use this data is twofold. One, to assist you to prioritize what efforts you want to take on in terms of increasing your overall automation. And two, I want you to take away this one point on this slide. And this is also referring to the J curve we talked about earlier in the presentation, and this data backs it up, which is 53% of DevOps leaders consider automation a critical business differentiator, meaning that it is absolutely critical for their process to have the automation in place and sustainable. And I can't emphasize more from my experience in the industry, where the lack of automation isn't necessarily due to the fact that there is a lack of skill. The lack of automation is 100% tied to the direction of the senior managers, meaning that, and this chart shows it, for those who consider it a critical business differentiator and declared it, they will achieve it. And you'll see here in this swing of 53% versus 27% is that this was one of the leading indicators of what a leader was doing versus what a laggard was doing it. And by the way, I'm almost embarrassed to actually have to have a narrative around this, because at the end of the day, we measure what's important and we prioritize what's important and we work towards those goals. But this just reemphasizes the point that if automation is not one of your critical business differentiators, you will fall behind. And it's just that simple. It seems stupid. It seems obvious. I agree. But I mean, here's some real rich data that if it is not an initiative that you are going to follow, you will fall behind. And Eran, why don't you just give me some cues here for moving through this build?
Sure. So that's a research that Perfecto has done quite recently, and I think what we have found, you just mentioned previously in the previous slide about the importance of automation to DevOps leaders. And when you automate, you can automate many things within the pipeline. But what we wanted to do with Perfecto in the previous research was to focus on the test automation as a specific item. And what we found out is 52% of the users are failing in the test automation. Every second test, if you like, is failing. And if we click forward, the good news about the finding were that 80% of the issues have a pattern. If we click next in the animation, we'll see that these failures or the pattern consists of three main reasons. One of them, and actually 50% of the failures, are due to script and framework, test framework related issues. 25% are around the lab. The lab will be a mobile device lab or a desktop web lab. And the remaining quarter of failures will be with regards to orchestration. If we unpack these three buckets, we'll see that when you talk about script and framework, we talked about properly identifying the objects in your test code automation or test automation code. The coding practices, are you allocating the right time and you putting enough synchronization between your steps? These kind of things. Following guidelines around page object models, these kind of things as well. From a lab perspective, if we unfold that, lab issues were around disconnection of devices or stability of the desktop VMs and mobile phones, smartphones, tablets that we're using, locking of the screens when you talk about mobile testing. If your devices are not in a ready state and unlocked, obviously your entire test automation will fail. So these were the two main reasons. The third one about orchestration was devices that are in use or no devices or desktop virtual machines available for execution. So from my perspective, and this will be the last animation in this slide, if you want to be successful in continuous test automation, you need to be able to address the following things. First, what is wrong with my test code, with my scripts? Second, what is wrong with my lab, whether it's an on-prem or a lab that you're using in the cloud? still you need to be able to address this question. And third, what's wrong with my execution? And even if you have a very good and stable test automation in place right now, automation like software is a moment in time. Next week, something changes and it might break your entire orchestration or your test code, your synchronization, and so forth. So at any given time, when you want to be a DevOps mature or continuous testing mature organization, you need to be able to answer these three questions at any given time, either using metrics, KPIs, dashboards, and so forth. So this is, in my mind, a very important, I would say, practice for you guys online. If you have it, it's fine. If not, it doesn't take that much to find and fix these issues. You will see that it can make wonders to your overall test stability.
I think this is a fantastic slide, first of all. It's the first time I've heard you talk through it. And it really does, tie in with the research too, because, it's not just the fact that you can automate a script, right? It's the idea that that script needs to be stable and run continuously. And this is even going back to the J curve we talked about, this point in which it is absolutely critical to commit to automation. Because at this point, it's kind of easy with these three questions to maybe just fall back on manual testing. So commitment to automation is required, and obviously these 3 points are critical to sustainable automation.
Definitely.
So moving forward, I want to make one last point, as we've made some pretty interesting comments associated with what's required to actually achieve test automation. And this slide and the next slide, which I'll pause on in a second, are kind of interesting points. Your CXOs overwhelmingly estimate your DevOps and continuous testing maturity, meaning that they are your champion, but unfortunately, the fact that they are their champion, they will deprioritize your requests for training, your request for process improvement, your request for automation investment, because they truly believe that your organization is, or they overestimate the capability of your organization. And I've had the chance, at Tricentis, we have a growth advisory board, and there's roughly 40 CIOs on this growth advisory board. And I've asked them about this. And what they say is, quite honestly, as they look to evolve their organization, they have to make some pretty hard decisions. And during those hard decisions, they also have to be the champion of the process itself. So they are overwhelming champions of your work, but their confidence also presents a challenge when you are going to walk into their office and ask for budget to improve automation or to continue your automation journey. So keep this in mind, which also means that your requests need to be data-driven, 100% data-driven, and understanding where those gaps are in your process and realizing them in the data is imperative for you to be able to state the case to move forward. The good point about this is that your CXO and your CIO is your champion. The bad part about this slide is the fact that they overwhelmingly believe that those best practices are already in place. So not only do you have to break the bad news to them, unfortunately, about the gaps that currently exist in the process, you also need to make the case with data how this level of automation is going to increase or decrease the risks that your organization will face. I thought this was a pretty interesting finding, and by the way, as we really segmented and started to tear into the data, this pattern around the CXO's exuberance about maturity started to really come about, and it was really one of the unexpected findings associated with the survey itself. So with that, I wanted to close with really 3 key recommendations. The first one is I can't overemphasize the fact that business risk needs to be the driver for your metrics program, meaning the context of the business and the risk associated with the business is really what your CIO and your business leaders are going to latch onto, meaning that counting metrics don't mean much to them. Having the business risks as the driver of those metrics are highly compelling, and you're speaking to them in terms that they understand and can invest in. Second, ruthless automation. And what I mean by ruthless automation is understanding that automation is the goal in a continuous process. And even if you do face the three challenges that Eran just presented, the idea is not to fall back to your manual processes due to time. The idea is to come up with a way to actually increase the maturity of resilient automation and to ruthlessly make sure your processes continue down your automated path. And then finally, prioritization. I think one of the biggest gaps that we do find today is that testing leaders basically use intuitive prioritization of tests. And by the way, you're usually right. Data will show you that you're only 38% right, but what we are doing as humans is we are basically making prioritization decisions around what tests to execute, predicated on our experience, and you can probably get to about 38% risk coverage on average using your intuitive mind to drive that testing prioritization. Using more data-driven approach to business risk coverage will get you up to the 80 and 90% coverage metric and also give you a really stable and prioritized test plan. So I would really can't emphasize more using technology to assist you to prioritize risk in your overarching prioritization process of tests. And this leads us to, we had a brief demo, but Eran, I think if we just showed people, which is unfortunate that this is not coming out very well, we have 6 minutes left. You think you want to maybe send the URL to the demo out to everybody and go with questions? Let me look to your guidance here on how you'd like to move.
Sure, Wayne. I think that we can send the link. We have a live demo, actually a recorded demo online with the link. We'll just share it with all of you guys, so we leave a few moments for a few questions that came in through the chat panel. And let's start going over a few of the questions. And one of the questions that I've seen, which was interesting, was about the skill set and the team structure and how they kind of relate, and continuous testing, DevOps, team structure, skill set. And my take on that, and I would like to also hear your take on that, Wayne, is that when you are going towards continuous testing, agile testing, so you are trying to shift not just the testing left, you are also trying to reorganize the teams, and trying to include more testers or developers with testing skills in the squad, in the feature teams that you have as part of your software delivery. And when you do that, this is the team structure conversation. You then need to see, okay, am I using, like you presented earlier, TDD as the methodology, BDD, traditional agile workflows, and that will also impact not just the team structure, but also the required skill set. Because if you implement BDD and you go with Gherkin and this kind of testing styles, you need different skills from your team members. If you go with things like machine learning and model-based testing, and we are familiar with this trend as well, you also need to take this under consideration and see whether you have the right members to do the job. What are you seeing, from a team structure and skill set with your clients?
So thank you for asking. I think we're seeing obviously this idea, two major motions, right? The first thing is the obvious shift left, right? Which we've been hearing about for 3-4 years now. And the second thing is the idea of the SDET, or the software development engineering test, which brings the technical skills back into the actual dev team, but for the test team, but specifically for testing. overall, when I think about the ADTT, TDD, BDD motion, the idea is really more about achieving the collaboration in my mind rather than the technical skill set required to achieve it. So I believe, and I totally believe this, that the tester brings a level of experience and know-how in terms of understanding how to test. If you asked a tester and you asked a developer to construct a plan to test anything, you would find the outcome significantly different because of their perspective. The developer has a pretty myopic set of expectations associated with what they're most familiar with, which is the code, whereas the tester or the traditional tester has a much broader expanse or set of experiences associated with not only usability but also functionality and end-to-end integration associated with the actual function itself. So from my perspective, there's been so much focus on skill, scripting and coding and that, but from my perspective, the most important thing to achieve is that ability to communicate and collaborate around what needs to be achieved with the test itself. And that is probably the biggest gap I see today in this team transformation.
Sure. Thanks, Wayne. Another interesting question that came in was about gathering data to plan tests instead of using experience. How do you suggest gathering data to plan the test? And I think we touched it during the webinar in a sense. As you're doing continuous testing, you automate a lot, you run a lot of tests throughout the life cycle, whether these are unit tests, functional tests, API tests, and so forth. You're also monitoring, you're doing test in production, you're monitoring your end users. This is test data. This is all data coming from your internal and external users. And based on that, you can definitely plan your test accordingly. You can decide, okay, these are the top test scenarios that I want to execute as part of my smoke, and these go into continuous integration. These are the top platforms, mobile devices, desktop VMs that are being hit in my production servers, mostly by my end user. These are the top platforms that I'm going to test against. So the test data can definitely be relevant for you to prioritize and decide which tests, which platforms are you using and running as part of your overall continuous testing.
Absolutely. Data matters. Absolutely. I know we're at the end of time here, but I'd also like to throw in here risk-based design. So being able, prior to you doing anything, to set some time during any kind of planning stage to understand the risk and the prioritization of your module, your component, any way you wish to define risk and come to a business conclusion about what those risks are, you should put into a risk-based design type program like Tricentis and come out with your priorities from a both data-driven and prioritization method, right? And then associate your test to that framework. I think that's the most important part. Eran, I know we're over time here, so I apologize.
Yeah. We have plenty of more questions that we couldn't address. We'll try to follow up with all of you guys online. Thank you for participating after the webinar. So with that, since we reached the top of the hour, I would like to thank you, Wayne, Tricentis, and all of you guys online for joining us today. We'll be sharing both the recording, all the assets, the links after the webinar with all of you. Thanks again.
Thank you.